The wolf was bleeding again, and again she did not run. Bryn Oswich set the bucket down on the frozen step and looked at the animal the way she looked at anything broken that needed tending, without ceremony, without fear, because fear had never once fixed a wound. The wolf was enormous, black-furred, going grey at the muzzle, and it had come to her door 3 mornings running now, always just before first light, always injured somewhere new. Tonight it was a gash along the left shoulder, deep enough that she could see the muscle beneath the torn fur. She had arrived at Havermore Estate 6 weeks ago with a single trunk and a letter of introduction that had gotten her nothing but a place in the lower kitchens, boiling linens, and hauling water for a household that had not asked her a single question about where she had come from or why. That suited her. She had spent the first 23 years of her life being asked questions she could not safely answer, and the silence of the winter estate, buried at the edge of the Ardennes territory under 6 feet of snow, was the first real quiet she had known. She knelt in front of the wolf now, in her nightdress and boots, breath fogging in the dark, and reached for the roll of clean linen she had started keeping just inside the door for exactly this purpose. "You again," she said, not unkindly. "Someone ought to teach you to stop losing fights." The wolf's amber eyes tracked her hands and did not flinch from them. It never did. That alone should have told her something, if she had known enough about wolves to know what it meant for one of them to hold so still under a stranger's hands, in a territory where every wolf answered to a king who had not, by all the kitchen gossip she'd overheard, let another living creature touch him without his permission in longer than anyone could remember. She packed the wound with yarrow and pressed linen against it until the bleeding slowed, murmuring the same nonsense she murmured to every hurt thing that came through her hands. The goat with the broken leg, the undercook's daughter with the fever, the crow with the clipped wing she'd nursed for a week last spring before it flew off without a backward glance. She did not perform this. There was no one awake to see it. She simply did what needed doing, the same way she did everything, because the alternative was to let something suffer, and she had never learned how to allow that. When she finished, the wolf did something it had not done before. It lowered its great head and set it deliberately into her open palms. She went very still. "All right," she said quietly, into the dark. "All right." The lower kitchens woke around her an hour later the way they always did. The clatter of the first pots, the undercooks arguing about the bread, the specific communal noise of people who had known each other for years, and had never once thought to include her in the noise. Bryn did not mind it the way she once might have. There was a kind of safety in being furniture. Furniture did not get asked where it had come from. Furniture was not made to explain a scar it did not want explained, or a father's name it had learned, very young, never to say aloud in rooms with strangers in them. A girl named Wilhelmina, who scrubbed the ovens 2 stations down from her, was the only one who ever spoke to her with anything like warmth, passing her the good end of the bread on cold mornings, showing her, without being asked, which storeroom shelf the steward never checked. It was a small kindness. Bryn had learned to notice small kindnesses the way other people noticed grand ones, because in 6 weeks at Havermore, the small ones were the only kind she'd been offered. She thought, as she worked that morning with her hands still smelling faintly of yarrow, about the wolf's head in her palms, and did not examine the thought too closely. She had learned that too, not to look directly at the things that might undo her carefully built stillness. She had seen the woman they called Lady Vantry exactly twice since arriving, once from a distance in the great hall, dressed in burgundy velvet that cost more than Bryn would earn in 3 years of scrubbing, and once up close, in the covered walk between the laundry and the kitchens, where the lady had looked at her the particular way high-status women looked at anyone beneath their notice, which was to say not at all, as though the space Bryn occupied was simply empty. Bryn had thought nothing of it at the time. Nothing. Invisibility, in a house like this, was the safest thing she owned. He was 3 miles away, standing in his own study with his hands braced on the windowsill, breathing like a man who had run further than his body remembered running, and he did not understand why his heart would not slow. Kestrel Ardane had shifted back an hour before dawn, alone in the servants' wood store, where no one would see, and had walked the rest of the way to his own house, with his shoulder throbbing under a bandage he did not remember putting on himself. He remembered kneeling. He remembered warmth. He remembered, more than anything, the specific and inexplicable stillness of not being afraid of someone's hands on him, which he had not felt, not once, not from anyone, in longer than he cared to count. His wolf had gone to her 3 nights running. He had let it. That was the part he could not make sense of. Standing in the cold grey light with his jaw tight, he had let it. The same way a man lets his own hand reach for something before he has decided to want it. He had ruled this territory for 9 years. He had buried a father, put down 2 challenges to his authority, and sat through more council sessions than he could stomach counting, and in all of that there had not been a single hour in which something had chosen for him without his permission. His wolf did not choose. His wolf followed his command, the way everything in his life followed his command, because that was the only way he had learned to survive being what he was. Except that 3 nights ago, on the edge of sleep, something in him had moved before he did, and it had walked itself to a servant's door on the low side of his own estate, and it had not stopped going back since. He splashed cold water on his face from the basin, and made himself sit through the morning's grain reports with the steward, made himself nod in the right places, made himself sound like a man whose attention was entirely on the northern granaries, and not on the memory of 2 steady hands and a voice that had called him nothing at all, only you, the way you'd address anyone hurt and in need of tending. Mother Perce found him in the archive 2 days later, exactly where she always found men who had begun asking questions they didn't know how to phrase. She was older than the keep itself, by the estate's reckoning, and had long since stopped bothering to stand when the Alpha King entered a room. She looked up from her ledgers with the specific patience of someone who had buried 3 kings, and would likely bury a 4th before she was done. "You're not here about the grain reports," she said. "No. Then you're here about the wolf that keeps going to the lower kitchens." She said it without looking up, which told him she had known before he had said a single word, which told him, in turn, exactly how visible his last 3 mornings had been. "Say what you know." She closed the ledger. "The Ardane bloodline wolf has taken food, unasked and unforced, from an unbonded hand exactly once in recorded history, 287 years ago. Your great-great-grandmother's wolf did it the season before she died, and no one in this house has seen it happen since. Not your father, not his father before him. 287 years, and then a kitchen girl with a bucket of yarrow." She looked at him properly now. "You already know what that means. You wouldn't be standing in my archive at dawn if you didn't." He said nothing for a long moment. "Her name," Mother Perce said, not unkindly, "is Bryn. She scrubs linens on the lower floor, and no one has asked her a single question about where she came from, which I suspect she prefers. You might start there instead of in wolf form." He turned the words over as he walked back through the cold corridors. 287 years was not an abstraction to him the way it might be to anyone else in this house. It was the exact number of years his family had spent explaining, quietly, to every visiting noble house, why the bond had gone dormant, why the old stories of Ardane wolves choosing their mates outright had become just that, stories, kept in ledgers, no longer anything a living king could point to and say, "This is true, I have seen it." And now it was true again, and it had chosen a woman who did not even know his name. He did start there, 3 mornings later, though not the way anyone expected. He came to the lower kitchens in ordinary wool, no crest, no guard at his shoulder, and found her exactly where the kitchen staff said she would be, elbow deep in a wash tub, sleeves shoved back, hair escaping a knot. She had clearly stopped fighting sometime around mid-morning. She did not recognize him. Why would she? She had been in Harvermore 6 weeks, and had likely seen the Alpha King exactly as often as every other invisible person in his household did, which was to say, never, from a distance, across a hall too large to bridge. "You're new," he said, because it was true, and because he did not know, standing there, how to say anything closer to what he meant. 6 weeks. She did not stop wringing linen to answer him, which no one in this house had done to his face in 9 years, and something in his chest loosened at the ordinariness of it. "You're new too, or I'd have remembered you. I get around less than I should." She glanced at him properly then, grey eyes, steady, the particular quality of attention that did not flinch and did not perform deference either, just looked, the way she had looked at the wolf's wound 3 nights running without once looking away from what needed doing. There was a thin white scar across her left thumb, old, and calluses along both palms from years of work he could not yet name, and she held herself with the specific, careful steadiness of someone who had learned, somewhere, that stillness kept her safer than most things did. "You've got yarrow on your sleeve," she said. He looked down. He had not noticed. "Do I?" "Someone's been treating a wound. Badly, if they let it get on their cuffs." She wrung out the linen and set it aside, and did not ask him whose wound it was, which he understood, standing there, was its own kind of grace. They talked longer than either of them meant to, about nothing that mattered. The state of the well pump, whether the winter would break early, whether the estate's cook understood the first thing about seasoning a stew. It was the first conversation he had had in longer than he could count that was not, in some fashion, about his territory, his authority, or his succession, and he found, walking away from it, that he did not want it to be the last one. The correction happened 3 days after that. A misfiled grain ledger she found and fixed without signing her name to it, leaving it back on the steward's desk, exactly as if no hand had touched it. He found it because he had started, without entirely admitting it to himself, checking the desk each morning. He read her correction 4 times before he understood what he was looking for. He was looking for her handwriting, which he had never seen, in a column of numbers that had nothing to do with either of them. He had the lower kitchen roster quietly altered that same week, so her shifts no longer ran past dark. He told his steward it was an administrative correction, overdue scheduling reform across 3 departments. His steward, who had served 2 Ardennes kings and buried his own opinions accordingly, did not ask why the Alpha King had personally reviewed the shift schedule of a single kitchen girl. She never knew whose hand had moved it. She noticed only that she walked home in daylight now, and did not think to ask why, though some nights, lying awake in the narrow servant's cot she'd been given, she found herself thinking of the stranger with yarrow on his sleeve, and wondering, without quite admitting she was wondering, whether she would see him again. Lady Odile Vantry noticed everything. She had spent 4 years cultivating her place at Kestrel's right hand, ever since her family's holdings had been folded into his after a border settlement neither of them had chosen, and she had learned in that time exactly how much attention the Alpha King paid to anyone. Which was to say, until 6 weeks ago, none at all, beyond what his position required of him. She found the shift roster change first, then the sleeve with yarrow on it, twice. Then, worst of all, she found him standing at the edge of the lower courtyard on a morning with no reason for him to be there, watching a girl in servant's wool carry water like it weighed nothing, with an expression Odile had never once managed to put on his face in 4 years of trying. "She's a servant," Odile said to him that evening, light as anything, over wine neither of them wanted. "You could have any bloodline in the territory. Half of them are in this room." "I'm aware. Then I don't understand the interest." He did not answer her, which she understood, with the particular cold clarity of someone recalculating a position she had thought secure, was itself an answer. She went to bed that night, turning over exactly what she would need, not proof of anything supernatural, because that could not be disputed, and would only make her look foolish for trying, but something ordinary and unglamorous and entirely deniable, a misplaced sum, a word out of place. Servants were dismissed from great houses for smaller things than that every season, and no one asked twice why. She found Bryn alone in the laundry yard 2 days later, folding linens with the same unhurried competence she brought to everything, and stopped in front of her the way a woman stops in front of something she intends to move out of her path. "You understand this ends," Odile said without preamble, "regardless of what you imagine is happening between you and the king. It has ended before, for women with far better claims than a servant's. He is fond of things that are new. He will not remain fond of you." Bryn did not stop folding the linen in her hands. "You've come a long way across the yard to tell me something you don't believe yourself." Something flickered behind Odile's composure. Not quite anger, something colder and more careful. "You have no idea what you're standing in the middle of." "No," Bryn agreed. "I don't. But I notice you're the one who came to explain it to me, instead of simply waiting to be proven right." She set the folded linen atop the basket and looked at the other woman directly, without deference and without malice, the way she looked at everything that needed to be looked at plainly. "If you have something to accuse me of, my lady, I'd rather you brought it before the council than the laundry yard. It would save us both the trouble of this conversation." Odile left without answering, and Bryn understood, watching her go, that she had just guaranteed the accusation would come sooner rather than later. Bryn saw him the way no one at Havermore had ever seen him, through the council chamber door 3 weeks in, after the lords had gone and the candles had guttered low. He was alone, holding the same petition he'd been holding when the session started 2 hours before, and he had not turned the page once. She did not go in. She did not let him know she had seen. She only stood in the corridor a long moment, understanding something she had not understood before, that the man managing everyone else's winter had no one managing his. She carried that alone into the following week, and said nothing about it to him at all, though it changed the way she watched him after that, not with fear, and not quite with the careful distance she kept from everyone else in this house, but with something closer to recognition, the kind you offer someone you suspect is as tired as you are, and just as unwilling to say so. He found her twice more that week, in ways that made no particular sense given the size of his territory and the smallness of the lower kitchens. Once at the well, where he carried her buckets the last stretch without being asked and set them down without comment, and once in the covered walk between the kitchens and the laundry yard, where they stood for nearly 10 minutes talking about a book of household accounts she had found improperly filed, until a bell somewhere called him back to duties neither of them wanted him returning to. The scent broke over her without warning on the morning the wolf did not come. She had gone to the door at first light out of habit, bucket in hand, and found the step empty for the first time in a month, and something in her, something she did not examine too closely, had gone tight with worry before she'd even admitted to feeling it. She stood there longer than she meant to, scanning the tree line at the edge of the courtyard, telling herself it was only an animal, only a wild thing that came and went as wild things did, and not quite believing the telling. She was still standing there, cold in her nightdress, when Kestrel came around the side of the kitchen wing in wool too plain for a king, favouring his left shoulder in a way she recognized instantly, because she had packed that exact wound with yarrow 3 separate times. She looked at his shoulder. She looked at his face. She did not say anything for a long moment, because the two facts sitting side by side in her mind refused at first to be true at the same time. "You," she said finally, very quietly. "Me," he agreed. "You're the wolf." "I am the wolf." He did not soften it, did not explain it away, only stood there in the cold with his shoulder aching and let her look at him the way she'd been looking at an animal for a month, steady, unflinching, unafraid of what needed tending. She was quiet long enough that he thought, for one terrible moment, that she would step back from him the way everyone in this house stepped back the moment they remembered who he was. She did not step back. "That explains the sleeve," she said instead, and something in his chest that had been braced for 9 years came very slightly undone. "I should have told you," he said. "I did not know how, and then I did not know how to stop it going on as long as it did. You could have simply said it. I am your king, and also the animal you've been bandaging in your nightdress." There was the faintest, driest edge of humor in it, the first he had heard from her, and it did something to him that the confrontation itself had not. "I considered it. It seemed likely to end with you fleeing across the border by morning." "I don't flee," she said. "I've never once found it useful." And she meant it, he understood, in a way that went considerably deeper than the conversation they were having. Odile moved within the week. Once she understood what she was looking at. She could not touch the mate bond. No one could, not with words, not with petitions. But she could touch a servant with no standing, no bloodline, no witness willing to speak for her. And she did, formally, before the full council, accusing Bryn of theft, a missing ledger entry, a sum unaccounted for, evidence Odile herself had arranged with a steward too frightened of her family's remaining influence to refuse. The accusation was read aloud in the great hall on a grey morning with half the household in attendance, ostensibly for an unrelated grain hearing that Odile had engineered specifically to guarantee an audience. Bryn was summoned from the lower kitchens, still in her work apron, given no warning, and made to stand before the assembled council, while a steward she barely knew recited a sum she had never touched, from a ledger she had corrected only once, months prior, and never signed. She did not cry. She did not protest loudly, the way Odile had perhaps hoped she would, giving the room something undignified to remember her by. She simply stood with her hands folded and her chin level, and said, when asked if she wished to respond, "I would like to see the ledger in question, not a copy, the original." The request unsettled the room more than any denial could have, because it was the request of someone who expected the truth to hold, and everyone present understood, watching her, that expectation was not something Odile had accounted for. Kestrel's composure, which had held through 9 years of council sessions and 2 challenges to his rule, did not survive the sight of Bryn standing alone before that chamber, with her hands folded and her chin level, facing an accusation built entirely out of air. He came off the dais before he had decided to move. The room went silent in a way it had never gone silent for him before. Not fear silent, but witness silent, because no one present had ever seen the Alpha King cross a room like that, like something in him had simply stopped answering to the part of his mind that managed rooms for a living. "Produce the original ledger," he said, and his voice did something none of them had heard it do. "Not the copy, the original in her hand from the week in question. It exists. I have read it. Produce it, or retract the charge, before I ask why it was made at all." Odile's steward did not produce it, because it did not exist to produce. He looked instead at Odile, whose expression had not moved, and then at the floor, which was answer enough for everyone in the room who had spent long enough in that court to recognize the specific silence of a man who has just understood he will be the one left holding the consequence of someone else's scheme. Odile tried once more, her voice perfectly level. "The absence of a document does not prove her innocence, my lord. It proves only that the steward is disorganized." "It proves," Kestrel said, "that you built an accusation on a document you knew did not exist, because you were certain no one would ask to see it. You were wrong about that." He turned to the assembled council, and his voice, when it came again, was not raised, which somehow made it carry further than shouting would have. "I have known this woman a matter of weeks. I have not known a single person in this hall, in 9 years, whose word I would trust further than hers on the strength of that acquaintance alone. Strike the charge, investigate the steward's ledgers properly, and Lady Vantry's role in compiling them, before this council entertains another accusation from her office. A murmur went through the seated lords. The particular sound of a room recalibrating around a truth it had not expected to be handed so plainly. One of the older council members, a man who had served Kestrel's father, and had never once in 9 years seen the son raise his voice for anything but border disputes, rose slowly from his bench. "My lord," he said, careful, testing the ground, "if the charge is struck without further proceeding, some will say the council's authority has been set aside in favour of—" He hesitated, choosing the word with visible care. "Personal feeling." "Then let them say it," Kestrel answered, "and let the record show precisely why. A false charge was brought against a woman with no standing to defend herself, using a document that never existed, by a member of this council with every reason to want her gone. If protecting her from that is personal feeling, I am guilty of it, and I would rather be guilty of that than of watching this chamber convict someone on air because no one present was willing to ask a single question." He did not look away from the old lord as he said it, and after a long moment the man inclined his head and sat back down, and no one else in the chamber spoke against it. Bryn, watching from the centre of the room, understood that something had shifted in that exchange that went beyond her own case, that the council had just watched its king choose honesty over the comfortable fiction of neutrality in front of every witness who mattered, and that they would remember it long after her name had stopped being the reason for the memory. The council's ruling came 3 days later, quiet and procedural, the way real justice in that house had always been. Odil's petition struck from record, her standing on the council suspended pending review, her family's remaining influence over Havermore's grain allocations returned to the Crown Steward's office. No spectacle, no fire, just a vote, and a woman who had spent 4 years building a position, watching it dismantled by paperwork. What showed in her eyes when the vote was read was not defiance. It was fear, the particular, ordinary fear of someone who has just understood that the thing she was protecting was never actually hers to protect. She left the chamber without a word to anyone, and the household noted, in the specific way households note such things without ever saying so aloud, that she did not attend another council session that season. He found Bryn afterward in the same corridor where she had once watched him unseen, and neither of them said anything for a long moment. He put his forehead against hers, and she felt him exhale, slow, deliberate, like a man setting something heavy down after 9 years of carrying it, without once admitting the weight. She put her hand flat against his chest, and felt his heart going too fast for a man who had just won. "You didn't have to do that in front of the whole council," she said. "Yes, I did." He did not open his eyes. "I have spent 9 years being careful in every room I walk into. I did not want to be careful in that one." They stood like that a long time, saying nothing further, and it was, she thought later, the first time in 6 weeks she had let herself stop bracing for whatever came next. There would be other rooms, other councils, other seasons in which the careful part of him reasserted itself out of old habit. She understood that much about him already, and did not expect otherwise, but she had seen, now, exactly what it cost him to set that carefulness down even once, and she found she wanted to be the reason he kept managing to do it again. She was offered a choice 3 days after that, in his study, with the door closed and no Crown between them, a letter guaranteeing her safety and freedom to leave Havermore entirely, sealed and ready, sitting on the desk beside a second letter that named her formally as his intended, equally sealed, equally ready. "You get to choose," he said, "not the wolf, not the council, you." She looked at both letters a long moment. "Why did you have the first one drawn up at all?" because I needed you to know I meant it when I said you get to choose." He was quiet. "I have never once in 9 years let anyone else decide anything that mattered to me. I'm aware of how that looks now, offered to you like a gift instead of what it actually is, which is the only thing I know how to give." She picked up the second letter. She did not open it yet. "Ask me properly," she said. "Not the wolf choosing. You. Stay," he said. "Not because something in me recognized you before I understood why. Because I am choosing you, with everything I understand about what that costs. And I would rather spend the rest of my life learning to be careless with you than spend one more year being careful with everyone else." She did not answer immediately. She set the unopened letter of freedom back down on the desk, deliberately, where he could see her choosing to leave it there. "Then say it once more," she said, "without the letters between us." And when he did, plainly, without ceremony, she crossed the small distance of the study and let him hold her the way she had wanted, for weeks now, to be held. 2 months later, the estate had settled into a version of ordinary that no one at Havermore had quite had before. The council had not entirely made peace with her. There were still lords who did not know what to do with a Luna who had scrubbed their linens 6 weeks before her name went into any record. But that fact was permitted to exist without anyone pretending otherwise. Mother Percy had taken to including her, without asking, in the quiet archive mornings where the estate's oldest records were kept, and had begun, without quite announcing it, teaching her to read the old ledgers of the bloodline she had married into, so that the next time something impossible needed explaining, there would be 2 people in the keep who understood it instead of 1. Bryn still kept a bowl by the kitchen door out of habit, though the wolf that used it now slept most mornings across the study hearth in his own skin, one arm thrown over his eyes, entirely unremarkable in a way that had taken 287 years to become possible again. Wilhelmina had taken to teasing her gently about it. The new Luna, still saving the good end of the bread for the ovens, still up before dawn out of habit no one required of her any more. And Bryn let herself be teased, because it was, she had come to understand, its own kind of belonging. She still carried herself, with the same careful steadiness she'd carried into this house 6 weeks ago. Some habits did not undo themselves, simply because the danger they'd been built for had passed, but she no longer held her chin level out of guardedness. She held it level because it was simply how she stood. Wilhelmina had been given a position overseeing the lower kitchens outright, a promotion Bryn had recommended, and Kestrel had signed without a single question. And the 2 of them still took tea together some afternoons in the kitchen that had once been the whole of Bryn's world, trading news the way they always had, as if a title had changed nothing essential between them. It hadn't, Bryn thought. That was rather the point of keeping it. He told her things now, matter-of-factly. The way he'd learned was his own particular shape of intimacy, his complicated history with the eldest council lord, his honest opinion of the state of the northern roads, the fact that he slept better with her weight against his side than he had slept in longer than he could remember, and had told her so without dressing it up as anything grander than the truth. Some evenings they sat together in the study in complete silence, her reading correspondence, him reading petitions, and neither of them needed the silence to be filled with anything at all. Mother Perce, for her part, had begun a new ledger entry the week of the wedding, a formal record, in her own careful hand, of the 287th year becoming simply the first of many, so that whichever Ardane came after Kestrel would not have to wait 3 centuries to understand what it meant when the bond chose someone the court had not thought to look for. On a cold morning in early spring, she found him at the hearth before she was fully awake, and he kissed her once carefully at the doorway, like a man who had spent a long time thinking about how to do it without frightening either of them, and had decided that slowly was the only honest answer. Outside, the bowl sat empty by the door in the pale morning light, kept there still, needed or not. It was not remarkable any more. It happened every morning. That was the whole point. The impossible thing had been patiently, deliberately made ordinary. And in the quiet of that hearth, with no one looking through anyone, that was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. Somewhere below them, the household was waking the way it always did. The first pots, the ovens, Wilhelmina's voice, calling something across the kitchen yard that made someone else laugh. And Bryn stood in the doorway a moment longer, listening to the ordinary sound of a house that had once looked straight through her, and did not look through her any more. If something wounded and unexplainable showed up at your door every morning, and you had no idea what it truly was, would you have kept tending it anyway? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one. Until next time.